The Haval H6 Hybrid might be the best deal in the C segment, but is the Hyundai Santa Fe Hybrid the best deal in the D segment? This might look like an extensive facelift to you and I, but actually underneath the skin there is a brand new platform. Now Hyundai Sime Hyundai says that this new platform gives the Santa Fe even better refinement, improved dynamics, as well as overall better packaging. But you can't escape the fact that this looks very similar to the outgoing model. What isn't similar, however, is what's going on under the skin, because in addition to the 2.2-litre turbo diesel, which continues to be available with all-wheel drive and an 8-speed automatic gearbox, there is now a new petrol variant. Gone is a 2.5-litre NA engine, replaced with a 1.6-litre turbocharged petrol engine mated to a hybrid system. That little battery lives underneath the floor and powers only the front wheels. As a result, this car not only has pretty decent performance numbers, but it's also got really good fuel economy, being able to do well over 800 kilometers on a single tank. We've verified that, in fact. Now, of course, any updated model has to come with updated aesthetics, and the Hyundai Santa Fe is no different. We now get a much wider front grille, which Hyundai is very proud to say reaches all the way to the edges of the bumper. It doesn't, because actually there are full LED headlights up here, replete with automatic high beam, although you still get manual leveling. The daytime running lights have also been reworked, where there is now a T-shaped design which starts from the top and bleeds into the main headlight segment here, which makes the car look very distinctive at night. We've lost the LED front fog lamps because now we have air breathers here, which help to improve the aerodynamics and improve this car's overall fuel efficiency. Down the side, the changes are limited to just the rolling stock. For the Hybrid Max, which we have here, rolling stock is handled by a set of 19-inch alloy wheels wrapped in Goodyear Eagle F1 SUV tires. Now, it is worth noting that for the hybrid model, it is only front-wheel drive. If you were to get the Diesel Max model, you get 20-inch alloys and all-wheel drive. That's one way to tell the cars apart. But as we move further down the side, this car is very traditionally designed. You've got a very typical large SUV proportion to it, and overall, I do think that this car looks quite handsome. I appreciate the fact that there are some bits of contrasting paint work or contrasting bodywork in order to help break up the monotony down the side. There is this strong shoulder line that actually extends from the front daytime running lights all the way to the tail lights, which help make this car look a little bit more muscular. And on top of that, there are actually functional roof rails up here, should you want to put a roof box or something like that on top of the vehicle. Now at the rear, the changes are a little bit more minor. You get a new set of full LED tail lights, as well as this new piece of red garnish here, which looks like a light bar, but it isn't. There is also an updated rear bumper in order to make this car look a little bit more modern, replete with this full width reflector strip down here. Now there are a couple of things I'd like to point out here. Number one, I don't know why there's Hyundai script here when there is still a badge here. And secondly, what you'd think are the indicators here are the reverse lights. The indicators are down here. I genuinely thought that with this facelift, they fixed the fact that the indicators were mounted on the bumper, but evidently not. Instead, they put the reverse lights up here because that's better for the reverse camera. I can't quite figure that out. Now, because this car rides on a brand new platform, it means that the hybrid battery has been able to be hidden underneath the floor, which means that back here, there is no compromise in terms of boot space or overall capacity, because as you can see, not only is there a huge amount of space here for things, but there is also a third row of seats, which you can lift manually. There are also air conditioning vents, making this relatively practical. There's also a 12-volt socket, and overall, it's quite clear that packaging has been a focus for Hyundai with the new Santa Fe, and overall, I can say that this is a relatively practical car. The interior of the Santa Fe has also been given a light going over in order to improve the things it was already good on, while also sort of renegotiating some features that people weren't so big on. So for example, we've lost the sunroof in this car, which is a bit unfortunate because as you can see, the interior of this car is quite dark. We've also lost the burgundy leather upholstery that we used to get in the Max models. Now it's all black, which I think is more what Malaysians want, but it also makes this interior look very drab. But in any case, the rest of this interior is quite good. So for example, in terms of material quality, you get a lot of soft touch material in most of the places that you touch, including the dash top and the dash front. You even get stitching on the dash front on multiple layers, which is certainly very nice. These seats were not redesigned in any way, but they do still feature ventilation and heating, as well as lumbar support for the driver when it's quite a significant amount of lumbar support, which is certainly nice. And you still get boss switches for the front seat, which means that you can adjust this without having to reach all the way around. Certainly very useful for some people. Now, this center stack has also been significantly redesigned because it's actually been brought further up, so it's a bit closer to the driver. And because it now uses an electronic gear selector, it means that it's freed up some space underneath the center console. So all of your USB ports and your 12-volt socket live down here. There is a little bit of space for, say, small bags and stuff like that. But more importantly, the center stack retains the majority of the physical buttons that we quite liked from the original pre-facelift Santa Fe. So there's a bank of buttons up here that control your HVAC system, which is certainly very nice to use, although there is no display because all of that is displayed in the center screen. What I do find quite interesting is that there is a driver-only function here, which means that if I press this button, only the two vents that actually cool me are still active, whereas everything else is switched off, including the air conditioning in the third row. Moving further down, you have your drive mode selector here where you can choose between Eco, Sport and Smart. You also get your buttons for the front parking sensors, 360-degree camera, hill hold or hill descent control, as well as your auto hold function. And down here, a small set of buttons to control, again, the heating and ventilation that I mentioned earlier. Your electronic gear selector lives here, and this is the same gear selector system that we've seen from electric Hyundais in the past. And so this is a very familiar system to use, and it is quite easy to get used to. Moving further beyond that, you actually have a USB port here, as well as a single cup holder, which is large enough for even a larger size bottle. You get another one up here, and you get a wireless charger that actually holds your phone at a very specific angle. There's actually a spring that keeps it pressed up against that wireless phone charger, which means that your contact point is pretty good, so that's nice. There's also a little bit of ventilation, although I found that my phone tends to heat up quite a bit. Moving further back, there's a decently sized center console bin. It's quite deep, although it's not quite wide. There's also a little shelf here for smaller items which you can remove, which is certainly nice to see. And overall, practicality in this car is pretty well catered for. The door bins can hold a litre size bottle, though not litre and a half. And this glove box is decently sized, although it's not lined in felt, which we would have liked to have seen given the price point that this car commands. Now, moving beyond that, there are a new set of screens. So this infotainment system has been updated and now offers wireless Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, although the size is still quite humble. And overall, I do quite like the way the system is set up, because even though the screen is small, it is sort of within my sight line, which means it's quite easy for me to see whatever information that I need here. There are also haptic touch shortcut buttons on either side in order to basically get your most used functions, and I've actually set up the favorite button on this side to go straight into phone mirroring. In front of me there is a digital instrument cluster which gives me all the relevant information that I need, including my displays for my regen as well as my battery level and so on and so forth. Now, Hyundai and Kia infotainment displays are not particularly customizable. When you change the drive modes, it does change the graphics a little bit, but in terms of overall customization, it's quite limited. However, the displays themselves are very, very easy to read. They're very legible. The font is great, which means that you can get all the information that you need at a glance. Now, if that's not enough for you, there is also a full color heads-up display up ahead of me, which also shows me things like my blind spot warning, my ADAS functionalities, my cruise control, as well as some navigation functions. I say some because it seems that it works on Apple CarPlay, but not Android Auto. Very odd. Now, before I move into the second row, there is actually one more feature that I want to point out about the digital instrument cluster. Now, Kia has popularized something called a blind spot camera system. We also saw this in Honda. They call it the Honda Lane Watch system. And what that means is when I indicate, it actually shows me a feed from the 360 cam, showing me my blind spot in the instrument cluster itself. This is in addition, obviously, to the blind spot monitoring system that is mounted on the wing mirrors themselves. This system is not something that you can get in all Hyundais. We didn't even find this in the Palisade because that's apparently a cost option. This is only thus far available in the Grand Staria, or the Staria Premium, not even the lower end models. And so I am very happy to see that this has made it into the Santa Fe, because this system is fantastic. And the fact that it is available in this car and not even the flagship Palisade just goes to show how much control Hyundai Sime Darby has over locally assembled models like the Santa Fe. Life in the second row is actually not that bad. With the front seats in my driving position, about 170 centimeters, I have a good amount of knee room and a pretty good amount of headroom. On top of that, these seats can actually be slid fore and aft should you want to make more space for the third row. And on top of that, these seats can actually be adjusted in terms of their recline angle, if I can find the lever. So you can actually sit very upright, sort of like this, if you are weird, or you can actually have it very reclined like this and take a nap. And it's certainly nice to have this level of customizability in terms of seating comfort. On top of that, you also have a deployable center armrest here with a couple of cup holders. I've got a couple of crotch coolers here, and the term is correct because they are mounted very low. I've got a couple of USB-A ports here, but there's also a household socket. Now, I say household socket with a bit of a caveat because that's certainly not a household that you'll find here. This is a 2-pin EU style socket, not a 3-pin plug that we're used to using here in Malaysia or in fact in the UK. And this is a very strange sort of specification option because it seems to me that not a lot of Malaysians actually have plugs that will fit this, which means you'll probably need a travel adapter to use it. And so I wonder why this was included at all. Now, beyond that, I do have a decent amount of practicality. There are decently sized pockets behind the front seats. I've got a decently sized door bin, big enough for a litre sized bottle. And there are also obviously ISOFIX mounts in the 2 outer seats, which is certainly great because these doors open quite wide, which means that fitting even a bulky rear-facing child seat should not be an issue. It is worth noting, however, that in addition to these 2 ISOFIX mounts, there's also an ISOFIX mount for the front passenger seat, provided that you shut off the airbag. So that means that, again, if you have a bulky rear-facing child seat, you can actually put that child seat in the front in order to free up more space in the second row, as opposed to having that seat here and then pushing up against the first row seat backs, which is certainly very nice. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the Santa Fe is a 3-row SUV, which means there is actually space back here for people, but only just. Now, like many 3-row SUVs, the Santa Fe is somewhat compromised in this regard. As not to compromise boot space, the seat bases in this car are mounted very, very low. So as you can see, I have no under-thigh support at all. And in fact, at this point, it's a miracle I have any support for my arse. Now, the backrests are also very flat, which means I don't have a lot of side support, but at least I do have air conditioning vents, which I can control from here, a USB port, and very small, very thin cup holders for like those Milo cans. But that's about it. On top of that, because of the way the window line sort of curves up in this car, I don't really have a very good view out back here, which means that if you were to put small children in the third row, their view is quite limited and so they might end up a little bit car sick. But at least, again, the inclusion of the third row air vents does mean that they should be relatively comfortable in that regard. There are no ISOFIX mounts in the third row, which is probably for the better because I can't imagine any car seat fitting back here. But most D-segment SUV buyers very rarely use their third row anyway. In fact, from what I know, most CX-8 buyers use their cars as a 5-seater or a 4-seater if you have that center console thing going on. And so this is largely a moot point. What is perhaps more pertinent with this particular car is the power efficiency and the way the powertrain works when you're on the move, because traditionally 3-row D-segment SUVs tend to be quite thirsty. And in fact, that remains the case given the last D-segment SUV we drove was the Tiggo 8 Pro. And so does the Hyundai Santa Fe do any better in that regard? Well, it bloody well should. Now, as I mentioned earlier, under the bonnet, this particular car is powered by a 1.6-litre turbo petrol, mated to a hybrid setup and a 6-speed automatic gearbox, sending power to the front wheels. Now, the Santa Fe currently has the distinction of being the only hybrid D-segment SUV out there, and certainly the only hybrid 3-row SUV out there within sort of the mass market space. And so that does mean that for the first time, for customers looking for a large family car like this, they have the option of electrification. The thing about hybrids is that traditionally they have come with some degree of compromise. If you look at, for example, the BMW X5, in order to make room for the plug-in hybrid powertrain, they've had to sacrifice a third row of seats. And the same goes with vehicles, for example, like the Toyota Corolla Cross, where in order not to impede on the space inside the car, they've had to minimize the size of the battery. But it seems that Hyundai's learnings from their Ioniq lineup of electric vehicles has resulted in a car that presents very few compromises in that regard. The electric battery is mounted underneath the floor of the cabin and is actually mounted over on the passenger side, and so it compensates and provides balance between the electric motor, or rather the electric battery, as well as the petrol tank. So that does create a very balanced sort of weight transfer, which is certainly nice to see. And from behind the wheel, again, there is not a lot of compromise in terms of the way this car drives. So Hyundais have always enjoyed a certain degree of a very dialed-in sort of driving experience where your steering wheel is very, very accurate and there is very little in terms of body roll. And that does remain the same for this Santa Fe. Even though the hybrid is a little bit heavier than the outgoing 2.5-litre NA, it doesn't feel it from behind the wheel. The steering wheel remains very accurate. The suspension in this car is incredibly well tuned. The primary ride in this car is soft enough to absorb the worst lumps and bumps on very badly surfaced roads, but the secondary ride in this car is good enough to maintain very good body control, even if you're driving a little bit more enthusiastically than you should. Now, that does lend this car a certain sort of character when you're driving in town. It means it's very comfortable, it's very isolating. On top of that, the windows in the front are all dual pane glass, which means that you are relatively isolated from the world around you. And when you're on the motorway, it also means that you have a certain degree of refinement, because that engine, being very small, is positioned very far away from the bulkhead, and so the noise intrusion is minimized quite a bit. And of course, because this car is a hybrid, it does also mean that it doesn't rev out that much, because the electric motor assists in areas like overtaking as well as from takeoff, and so the engine never really strains itself. So that's certainly a good thing. However, going back to enthusiastic driving, you will realize one of the downsides of this powertrain is that it's not particularly responsive. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this car comes with Eco, Sport, and Smart driving modes. Smart is basically a situation where the car will figure out which driving mode is best based on your current driving style, and so it will fluctuate between Eco and Sport. However, in neither of those modes does it make this car particularly engaging to drive, because this powertrain response does seem a little bit muted. It seems quite clear that this being the hybrid, the focus is very clearly on fuel efficiency, and so it's done that at the compromise of some degree of driver engagement as well as some degree of responsiveness from the powertrain. Now, for a driving enthusiast, that certainly doesn't sound like a good thing, because you want your car to be able to respond quickly to driver inputs. However, this is not an enthusiast car. This is a 7-seater SUV. So why would you be driving it like that in the first place? Drive it sedately, and this car does actually seem quite reasonable to live with. Because, for example, when you're driving about sort of like this, when you're stuck in traffic, driving through suburban traffic and suburban sprawls and stuff like that, the engine remains very, very quiet, because the majority of your mobility is provided by the electric motor, which is able to power you all the way up to about 70-80 kilometers an hour when driven like this. On the motorway, the electric motor is actually able to power the car at up to 120 kilometers an hour, provided that you're not demanding acceleration. If you're just trying to cruise thereabouts, the engine can actually shut off at relatively high speeds and simply be powered only by the electric motor, which is very impressive for a hybrid system like this. However, trying to get up to motorway speeds will reveal one of this car's slightly more significant issues, because the lack of response in the powertrain is not a big deal. The bigger deal is the fact that actually this car is not that powerful, because while you have a turbocharged 1.6 litre up front, ultimately the Santa Fe is a very large and very heavy car. And so even when you put your foot down, this car never really sort of gets up and goes. Even with the assistance of the electric motor, that doesn't really happen. When you put your foot down, the car will pick up in a reasonable sort of manner, although it never really pins you in the back of your seat. It just sort of gets on with it. And so that does underline again that this is not a car to be driven particularly enthusiastically. That is not really the point. Getting up to 120 kilometers an hour from a motorway on-ramp is a gradual affair. You'll get there eventually. It is not something that you dart into like you would in an EV. And so driven like that, driven reasonably, this car is actually a pretty decent companion. Now, we've driven this car about 300 kilometers since we picked it up. And during that time, this car has reported a very, very healthy 6.5 liters to the 100, which I think is pretty decent given the size and weight of this car, as well as the features and practicality on offer. In order to get numbers like that, you'd usually have to revert to a diesel. And of course, this car is available with a diesel motor. And I've no doubt that that powertrain works a lot better if you're just bombing up and down the motorway. But for mixed use applications, this car makes a lot more sense, because this powertrain does provide enough duality in order to sort of keep up with motorway traffic when you do need to do longer runs. But when you're just driving about in town like the majority of buyers would, this powertrain does remain relatively efficient. So does that mean that I'd look down on the Santa Fe for this powertrain? Absolutely not. But it does sort of beg the question as to whether or not hybrid powertrains like this have a place in larger SUVs like this. I mention this because I still remain very impressed with what we've seen from the GWM Haval H6. Because of the way that powertrain is set up, you enjoy 530 Newton meters of torque while still only maintaining a 1.5 litre turbocharged engine. And because the majority of your drive is provided via the electric motor, it does feel a lot smoother. I bring that up because when this car is stuck in stop and start traffic, you will find that the petrol motor has to sort of come in and out from time to time in order to charge the hybrid battery to provide more electric motivation. And so when that happens, the transition between electric and combustion is not as smooth as I would have liked it. It's certainly not on par with what we've seen from Volvo, and it's certainly not on par with what we've seen from GWM, which is quite impressive for GWM, I must mention. But If you were to overlook that very minor niggle, the Hyundai Santa Fe is a pretty well-specified package for what it is. It provides D-segment 7-seater SUV practicality while still being able to run it on a relatively small budget. And that's before we touch on this car's active safety features, which are incredibly comprehensive. In addition to that blind spot camera that I mentioned earlier, this car also comes with a full level 2 active safety suite, which means that you get things like autonomous emergency braking with pedestrian and cyclist detection, you get traffic jam assist along with your radar guided cruise control, you get lane keep assist, lane centering control, blind spot monitoring, rear cross traffic alert, and rear AEB. All of these things work together to make this a very comprehensively equipped family car. It's certainly not a vehicle that I would question if I had to cart my family around in it, and I certainly believe that other consumers who are looking at this as a family car would also appreciate the fact this car does seem to be specified for safety. So overall, if we look at the pros and cons of this car, it's very clear this car is very refined, it's very comfortable, it's relatively good to drive for what it is, although it's certainly not an enthusiast car. The downside to this is it's not quite as efficient as the GWM Haval H6, but again, the Haval doesn't offer 7 seats, which makes this currently the best equipped and best powered 7-seater SUV on the market, particularly as we consider that in the very near future, we're no longer going to have subsidies for our RON 95 petrol. So would I recommend the Hyundai Santa Fe? Absolutely. Given the fact this car comes with a 5-year warranty as well as an 8-year warranty for the high voltage system in this car, it does mean that you can buy this car with a degree of confidence. For certain customers who may not be swayed by Chinese brands out of whatever unfounded concerns you might have, then this is the next best option. And of course, if you're looking for a hybrid with 7 seats, then this is basically it. It's either this or the Nissan Serena S Hybrid, which is a very flawed, very compromised vehicle in every measure. And so I wouldn't even consider that in the slightest, especially if you only use the third row very occasionally. However, if you're considering a hybrid SUV because you need space in the second row and a large boot, then once again, the GWM Haval H6 HEV makes a lot more sense. That car is well under 140,000 ringgit retail. It offers a slightly more advanced powertrain with far better fuel economy figures both in town as well as out on the motorway. However, if you're looking at a D-segment SUV as something that you'll be doing a lot of motorway miles in, then of course you have the Mazda CX-8 diesel with its unlimited mileage warranty and 5-year service package. Or if you really like the Hyundai Santa Fe, you can also get this car with that 2.2-litre turbo diesel powertrain and an 8-speed automatic gearbox, which also benefits from having the H-Track all-wheel drive system, which means that you can drive this car on slightly slipperier conditions with more confidence. Overall, what's very clear to me is that this extensive refresh of the Hyundai Santa Fe has resulted in a really well-engineered and well-specified vehicle. And on top of that, Hyundai's continual promotions when it comes to their cars means that you can actually pick this up for a relatively good deal. I don't think anyone's paying sticker at this point, which means that you can get this brand new Santa Fe with a warranty, with all the coverage that you need, without much compromise in terms of after-sales support. In any case, that concludes our review of the Hyundai Santa Fe Hybrid. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, hit the little bell icon to notified every time we make a new upload. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. All the links are in the description below, including the link to our new WhatsApp channel. Thank you so much for watching. We'll catch you in the next one. Take care, stay safe, and jangan bodoh.